кратко сообщить о том, что наше мероприятие сегодня будет на двух языках, на русском и английском. Для тех, кто хотят услышать перевод, можете найти вот такой значок «Глобус» в меню. И если на него нажать, вы можете выбрать русский язык, чтобы услышать перевод с английского на русский. Все ваши вопросы вы можете задать нашим уважаемым спикерам. Сегодня вы можете для этого либо поднять руку, нажимая на вот эту кнопочку «Поднять руку» в это меню, или через вкладки «Вопросы и ответы» в течение всего мероприятия. Вот Тадзю тогда вот передаст вам слово. Хотелось бы еще обратить ваше внимание на то, что во время мероприятия ведется запись, и также ведется трансляция на YouTube. Спасибо вам большое за внимание. Dear colleagues, good morning. We are extremely pleased to welcome you today to the event of the Association of European Businesses titled The European Union and Russia, Allies, Partners, Rivals. Before giving the floor to our today's moderator, our AB CEO Tadzio Schilling, I would like to inform you that this event will be in two languages, in English and Russian. Therefore, if you need some interpretation, you will find a globe icon in the menu, and if you click on it, you can choose English to hear the interpretation from Russian into English. You can certainly ask all your questions to our speakers today. This time, you can either raise your hand by using the button "Raise Your Hand" in the menu, and Tadzio will give you the floor to intervene, or you can place your questions in the Q&A section in the menu. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that this event is being recorded and also broadcasted on YouTube. Thank you very much for your attention, and Tadzio, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marie, and good morning to everyone. We are very glad to have you on this call today, and a warm welcome also to our today's speakers, and thanks for having accepted our invitation. This difficult year is finally about to come to an end, and let me remind you to start with from my perspective, most important lesson that 2020 brought to us. That in the face of such challenges as the pandemic and climate change, which has also gained in urgency during this year, it has become very clear that such challenges cannot be overcome or solved by any state individually or alone. So there is an acute need for dialogue, and we need to be ambitious, but we also need to find compromise. We need to build bridges, and we need multilateral cooperation. Friends from the EU delegation have recently organized two very important conferences. One was the conference on healthcare, and the other was the big conference organized together with Skolkovo on climate change. So we are very glad to see that actually, despite all odds, the dialogue is continuing. From our side, we recently implemented the Northern Dimension Forum together with our partners, which is one of the few remaining platforms of pragmatic, depoliticized dialogue where both the EU and Russia and several individual countries like Finland very much involved and try to tackle all the issues in the northern part in the Arctic region that is bordering both regions. At the same time, we have seen an increase in tensions and confrontational rhetoric over the last months as well. Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, who has met with the AEB on the 5th of November, and we had a very constructive dialogue, also recently publicly questioned the need or the appropriateness of continuing a dialogue with Brussels. And from the EU side, we have seen that they strengthened the muscle by adopting a EU version of the Magnitsky Bill. Discussions are also increasingly tough around the topic in the area of climate change, such as the cross-border adjustment mechanism that is currently planned or discussed in Brussels as part of the new Green Deal that has been announced last year. So to sum up, if we do not act, if we do not find a way out of this deadlock, we risk to miss the most important lesson of 2020 that I outlined in the beginning, that we have to overcome these challenges together. We risk to be engulfed in confrontational rhetorics and in a zero-sum game instead of focusing on win-win issues and win-win solutions. We originally wanted to start our 25th anniversary year activities with a conference on the future of the EU-Russia relationship. The title of this conference was called Looking Back to Move Ahead, Europe and Russia in the World of Tomorrow, where we really wanted to take stock of the 25 years of our existence, what has been achieved together, what were the milestones, but then also drawing the lessons, look ahead, and define the crucial topics for future development and cooperation. Unfortunately, both the pandemic and recent increased geopolitical tension around such instances as the Navalny case, then Belarus elections, forced us to postpone the event to next year. It will be held, but it has a delay. But we did not want to just skip or postpone the event. We wanted to not leave it as a void, but wanted to replace it with something fresh and new, and an event where we would gather new ideas and new insights that will help us strengthen our dialogue next year. And if you're looking for new and fresh ideas, what would be more appropriate than turning to the scientific world, to experts who are generating such new ideas every day? And so I'm very pleased that today we are having this event with our experts that I'm going to present you in a second. The idea is very simple, and already in 2014, when this whole situation emerged, this turning point in the EU-Russia relations, I had the honor to organize a conference together with the German-Russian Forum in the Altai region, and we decided to call this small conference Concept, Not Sanctions. And the idea is very simple, that we do not need more sanctions or more confrontations. We need new ideas, how to overcome the deadlock and move forward. And if we look back on the 6 past years, there's quite a large amount of ink and gray brain material has been spent on developing actually new concepts and ideas, how to move to a more positive trajectory. And I think today's event will allow us to take stock of these efforts. So I'm very pleased today to welcome as our guests Nadezhda Arbatova, head of the Department of European Politics Studies, professor at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Science, short IMEMO. Then Hans-Joachim Schwanger, head of research department at the Leibniz Institute of Peace Research in Frankfurt, and research professor at the High School of Economics in Moscow. Andrei Kartunov, general director of the Russian International Affairs Council. Thierry de Montbrial, he will join us in a few minutes, executive chairman of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. Marek Dombrovsky, non-resident fellow at the Bruegel Institute and professor at Higher School of Economics in Moscow as well, and Andrei Baikov, vice rector of the IMGIMO, the biggest university on international affairs in Russia. As for the scenario, dear speakers, dear guests, I suggest that first we give the opportunity to each speaker to make an introductory statement of 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will address one short question to each of you from the podium, and then we open up to have a true Q&A interaction with our members and guests that have joined today. To this end, as Marie has said, please use the raise your hand function so that we know that you have a question. We will then open your microphone, or if you don't want to speak, you can also obviously type your question in the chat function, and we will then read it out and ask the speakers to answer this question. If you have a question to a specific speaker, obviously I think it would be good if you mention either orally or in the written question to whom you would like to address this question. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to the first speaker of today's panel, Nadezhda Arbatova. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Тадзио, за предоставленное слово. Я попытаюсь уложиться в 10 минут. И хотела бы начать с прямого ответа на вопрос, который содержится в названии нашего вебинара. Кто мы? Союзники, партнеры или соперники? Мы никогда не были союзниками, если говорить о Российской Федерации и Европейском Союзе. Совсем недавно мы были партнерами и обсуждали новое соглашение о стратегическом партнерстве. Сегодня мы фактически соперники или даже сказать больше оппоненты. Я бы хотела дальше остановиться на причинах деградации отношений России и Европейского Союза. Это очень неблагодарное дело, потому что из опыта моих конференций я знаю, что обычно все сводится к обвинению. Первым нарушил статус-кво после окончания биполярности. Я постараюсь избежать этого соблазна и проанализирую причины деградации отношений России и ЕС достаточно непредвзято. На поверхности лежит кризис на Украине и вокруг Украины. Но кризис этот, так же как и Кавказский кризис, возник не случайно. Он был порождением тех глубоких разногласий, которые существуют у России и ЕС, Запада в целом, относительно основ европейской безопасности и соперничества на постсоветском пространстве. То, что Запад, я имею в виду и НАТО, и ЕС, неоднократно подчеркивали, что расширение ЕС и НАТО – это взаимодополняемые процессы, заставило Москву воспринимать Европейский Союз как альтер-эго НАТО. Но это еще не все. Эти разногласия тоже возникли не случайно. Они связаны с теми ошибками, которые допустили и в Европейском Союзе, и на Западе в целом, и в России. Поскольку распался Советский Союз, наши западные партнеры посчитали, что все было правильно в их политике, что ничего не надо менять. К России стали относиться как к побежденной державе, и многие политологи говорили о том, что она теперь не заслуживает уважения, которое обычно оказывали великим державам. Это практически прямая цитата из труда одного ученого. Россия, в свою очередь, допустила очень серьезные ошибки. Демократы, которые пришли к власти, считали, что сам факт их победы является достаточной гарантией для демократического развития, а волшебная рука рынка сделает все за них. Более того, они не сумели сформулировать новую повестку дня в отношениях с новыми независимыми государствами на постсоветском пространстве и очень скоро вернулись к старой формуле «экономические выгоды за политическую лояльность». Но и это еще не все. В глубине вот этой матрешки есть самая маленькая матрешка. Это трагическая история России, которая неоднократно отрезала ее от Европы. 250 лет монгольского ига сформировали особый менталитет, особую государственность и были препятствием для социально-экономической интеграции России в Европу. Что сегодня? Что мы имеем сегодня? В истории наших отношений было много пиков и падений, но никогда они не были такими плохими, как сейчас. Даже сценарий общего врага применительно к COVID-19 не сплотил их. Для Европейского Союза главное условие для нормализации отношений – это выполнение Минских соглашений, для России – это снятие санкций. Формальным форматом является для Европейского Союза, формальным форматом отношений с Россией, избирательное сотрудничество. Но, на мой взгляд, это не столько избирательное, сколько ограниченное сотрудничество. Потому что, несмотря на то, что на декларативном уровне список общих угроз достаточно широк, когда мы начинаем рассматривать эти угрозы более детально, мы видим, что у нас очень много расхождений и по этим проблемам. Ну вот, несмотря на то, что мы по Ирану полностью сходились и хотели спасти эту сделку, в общем-то, ничего не получилось, потому что и отношение к Ирану у России и у Европейского Союза разные. И можно привести очень много примеров. Хизбалла и Хамас для России это не террористические организации, для Запада это террористические организации. То есть недостаточно иметь просто список общих угроз, должно быть сходство оценок этих угроз и, самое главное, очень высокий уровень доверия, который был разрушен украинским кризисом. Вместе с тем нужно признать, что застой в отношениях России и ЕС создал такое явление, которое я называю confrontation fatigue. Это можно сравнить с enlargement fatigue. Огромное количество внутренних вызовов Европейскому Союзу, я не буду их перечислять, вы сами прекрасно знаете о них, осложняется еще и внешнеполитической повесткой дня, и в частности вот этой конфронтацией с Россией. Именно поэтому ряд европейских политиков неоднократно предпринимал попытки наладить связи, навести мосты, и мы знаем попытки Олланда, Юнкера. Сейчас таким архитектором является Макрон и делает очень много, и мне кажется, правильно. Вот мы перешли к формату, в общем, двусторонних отношений. Я знаю, что Брюссель всегда очень подозрительно относился к тому, что Россия пытается, значит, расколоть Европейский Союз и делает ставку на двусторонние отношения. Но мне кажется, что в сегодняшних условиях это наиболее реалистичный формат отношений. Когда нет ничего, лучше вот это, чем ничего. И я опять же хочу сказать об усилиях Макрона, который, мне кажется, делает очень важное дело. И уже в самом конце я бы хотела сказать, что будет дальше, как будут развиваться отношения России и ЕС, от чего они будут зависеть. На мой взгляд, они будут зависеть прежде всего от внутриполитического развития и Европейского Союза, и России, от векторов их развития. Сумеет ли Европейский Союз преодолеть кризис либеральной демократии, справиться с проблемой мигрантов, что будет после выхода Великобритании, ну и многие-многие другие внутренние проблемы. Для России самым главным вектором, который будет определять ее или сближение с Европейским Союзом, или уход в сторону, является императив модернизации. Вот если Россия вернется на путь модернизации, который не состоялся, при президенте Медведеве были поставлены такие цели, но этого не случилось. Вот возвращение на путь модернизации, уход от экспортно-сырьевой экономики будет тем индикатором, что Россия вернулась все-таки к своим корням, к своим европейским корням. И это не об отношениях с Европейским Союзом. Этот европейский путь гораздо шире. И экономическая модернизация потребует и политическую модернизацию. Вот, на мой взгляд, Европейский Союз должен очень пристально следить за тем, как будет Россия действовать именно в этой сфере. Спасибо.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for sharing your views. Indeed, a very sober, if not overly optimistic for now assessment, but we'll have time to come back to this later. I would like to hand over directly to Joachim, that you share with us your view on the topic of today's seminar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tadzio. I think that nicely follows on of what Nadia is just saying, I would also like to focus on the 3 items of the title of this online meeting: allies, partners, rivals, ? And let me start with allies, which looks actually fairly misplaced and rather utopian in present circumstances. And as Nadia said, the EU and Russia have never been allies. However, I think that needs not be the case and may reflect even a lack of imagination. Take, for instance, representatives of the realist school in international relations, notably in the United States and most prominently represented by the scholar John Mearsheimer. He has been calling for such an alliance between the US, in his case, and Russia for quite some time. And moreover, he is even deeply convinced that it will materialize sooner or later. The reason is straightforward and has nothing to do with a love affair with Russia. Rather, it is the rise of China and the threat which such a rise allegedly poses to the rest of the world, since with the economic muscle come political ambitions. The current clash between China and Australia may be indicative of that. Such a threat calls for balancing, and this need for balancing, in his view, not only energizes the United States and its traditional allies in Europe, but no less Russia. Henry Kissinger's ping-pong diplomacy of banding together the United States and the People's Republic of China in the 1970s shows that such a reasoning is anything but far-fetched. After all, by all ideological standards, Maoist China at that time was much more alien to the United States than the Soviet Union. Mention only its backing of the Khmer Rouge of the killing fields in Cambodia. But in spite of all reservations, China proved a convenient partner to balance and ultimately contain the Soviet Union, which at that time was considered the main threat. The current rise of China and the concurrent global power shift are set to create similar conditions. And Mearsheimer therefore expects the United States and China to engage in an intense security competition with considerable potential for war. The classic Thucydides trap, which has opened up all too often in similar historical conditions. The first traits of that are already visible, and they by no means merely reflect the vagaries of the outgoing US president. However, such a course of events is no law of nature, and the imminent risks depend on a specific reading of international relations. Yet it is quite obvious that in any case, an emerging bipolar Cold War-like constellation between the United States and China puts both the EU and Russia into an uncomfortable position. It forces them to choose, and it severely reduces their room of maneuver. In the case of the European Union, it threatens truly indispensable economic opportunities. And in the case of Russia, it impairs its much wanted sovereignty. Perfect conditions, to my mind, for an EU-Russia at least banding together. Let me turn to the other 2 characteristics, partnership and rivalry. It is obvious that currently we find both in EU-Russia relations. It's not just opponents. This is clearly reflected in the conceptual notions to craft their relations which are being floated around. They unanimously combine both selective engagement, one of the 4 principles of the EU-Russia relations, cold partnership, you mentioned that in your invitation to this meeting, the UN scenario, peaceful coexistence borrowed from the Cold War, which characterized the final stage of it, cohabitation, the French modus operandi, if you wish, enlightened realism, pragmatism, responsible interaction, and the like. The common denominator of these signposts is that they reflect the departure from great designs or visions, which in itself may not be wrong if one shares the view of the former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt that once you have visions, you better go to a psychiatrist. But such restraint may also be advisable in light of the fact that great designs, be it the greater Europe of the Paris Charter for a new Europe, be it the revived European concert of nations or great powers, only consume energy for unattainable goals. However, another common denominator is a regrettable fact that on both sides, there is no unanimity in understanding what is actually meant by these principles. In the case of the promulgated realism, for instance, the Polish discourse emphasizes that one should be realistic about Russia, and that means hands off. Whereas in France and Germany, realism means that we cannot and should not do without Russia, at least when tackling common challenges from climate to digitalization to international conflicts. Therefore, not much has come out of these guiding principles. Inertia prevails. And this raises the question as to the very nature of the current conflict between the EU and Russia, which is certainly running deep, but is far from being antagonistic, contrary to the Cold War. What is then the nature of the current conflict and how this can be tackled? To my mind, two salient propositions stand out. With regard to the European Union, othering seems to be playing a pivotal role. This means, in most general terms, that defining oneself and one's self-consciousness require the existence of a constitutive other as a counterpart entity. Othering is a permanent act of demarcation and a discursive distinction between us and them, pretty much in a ranking sense. Contrasting democracy and autocracy, or modernity and post-modernity, is such an exercise, as is a self-concept of the European Union as civilian power and or normative power. The latter refers to the fact that on the one hand, the EU is certainly a force multiplier for its members, but at the same time, due to its very nature, a power projection inhibitor, at least when it is to move beyond the power of the common market. Russia's main concern, on the other hand, and to my mind, revolves around, and Nadia mentioned it, the issue of recognition, another concept of political science. It is in a way complementary because it implies not only respect and status consciousness, but also readiness to accept differences. In other words, otherness as principally equal. For the EU, this is hard to stomach. For the reasons cited above, but also because liberals have been notorious as line-drawing subjects par excellence. This may have to do with the competitive nature of the liberal political systems. In response, Russia tried to force its denied recognition upon the European Union by means which have had an even more alienating effect. This mismatch has been the source of deep misunderstandings, and current conflicts can be conceived as derivatives of this basic conflict. However, they are by no means of such a fundamental nature that they can hardly be overcome. As a pragmatist and as an optimist, I hope for the gradual spillover effects of the ongoing everyday cooperation, for which, as outlined above, international conditions may become even more conducive than adverse, provided decision makers on both sides show a measure of enlightenment and courage, which seem to be in short supply currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Joachim, for sharing your views. And now a next speaker On our panel is Andrei Kortunov, the General Director on the Russian International Affairs Council. Andrei, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Tadzo. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very interesting and very timely conversation. I would also like to use this opportunity to express my appreciation, and I would even venture to say my admiration for the Association of European Business in Russia. I think that you demonstrate a lot of commitment and resilience under extremely challenging political circumstances, and that has to be appreciated and recognized.
Thank you.
Now, let me start with a reference to a book which was written about 20 years ago by a distinguished American intellectual and public figure of conservative flank, Robert Kagan. He wrote a book in which he tried to compare political cultures of the United States and Europe. And the title of the book is very indicative. I think that even those of us who have never read it know about it. It was Americans are from Mars and the Europeans are from Venus. And that book became a bestseller. And I think that in certain ways it was an eye-opener on very important cultural differences between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. When I read the book, I started thinking about where would I place Russians in this equation. And after some thinking, I came to the conclusion that if Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus, then Russians are probably from Jupiter. Indeed, it's a very different environment. Jupiter is further away from our sun. The sun is dimmer there. The force of gravity is much stronger because Jupiter is a bigger planet. And definitely the conditions for those who live in Jupiter should be more challenging than conditions of those who might reside in Mars or in Venus. However, it is still our solar system. It's not a galaxy far, far away. It's not really even Alpha Centauri, our neighboring solar system. We belong to the same milieu, we belong to the same environment, and definitely in this sense, there should not be irreconcilable contradictions between Russians, Europeans, and Americans. However, we tried to get closer with the European Union for 30 years, and we tested a couple of opportunities, a couple of models. Unfortunately, all of them failed. The first inclination on both sides was to use the so-called pan-European institutions and structures like OSCE or the Council of Europe to bring the continent together. It didn't work, and it became clear that it couldn't work. So the second option was to give Russia a sort of special status in Europe without giving Russia veto power. And we experimented with the Russian NATO Council in the security domain. We tried to entertain 4 spaces for cooperation between Moscow and Brussels, but again, it didn't work. Finally, there was an attempt to cultivate this common space through 2 pillars, the Western pillar and the Eastern pillar, both in terms of security and in terms of development. With NATO, it was, of course, an attempt to have a partnership between the Atlantic Alliance and CSTO on the eastern side in the development domain. It was an attempt to build this two-legged Europe with the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. Again, that hasn't worked, and I don't think it will work, at least in the foreseeable future. I don't believe in any institutional solutions to the problems between Russia and Europe, at least with this current generation of political leadership on both sides. And it's not about failures of specific political projects. It's more about fundamental differences in visions about the world, about the international system, about the direction in which the world order is evolving. I don't think that these differences can be reconciled. I don't think that Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin will speak the same language anytime soon. And I think that we shouldn't even try to look for an institutional solution to our problems. Instead, I think that it would be much more appropriate to replace the top-down approach by the bottom-up approach, and to try to use these couple of years that we have in front of us in order to accumulate elements of cooperation on very specific, very incremental, very concrete issues. And here I fully agree with what Joachim has just said about the importance of specific agreements, importance of thinking very locally sometimes, but to gradually build this infrastructure that might ultimately lead to more ambitious and more strategic projects. I think that unfortunately, especially with the recent elections of the in the United States, the European Union will continue to gravitate towards the United States, and the election of Joe Biden will be considered by many in the European Union as an excuse to postpone the idea of strategic autonomy for indefinite future. I also believe that the gravitation of Russia towards China will continue, and I think that basically nothing can stop this gravitation anytime soon, at least as long as the two leaders remain in Moscow and Beijing. This strategic partnership is going to evolve further. However, it doesn't mean that we should limit our ambitions to status quo maintenance. Definitely, there are opportunities. And though this year, in my opinion, was a year of missed opportunities for Russia and for the European Union, we missed to start a practical cooperation on COVID-19. We missed an opportunity to achieve tangible progress on Ukraine. We missed an opportunity to restart a dialogue with our major European partners, including the Federal Republic and France. Unfortunately, Nadezhda spoke about Macron, but I think that we have to confess that his attempts to look for a reset on behalf of France, but also on behalf of Europe at large, has not brought any practical results. And in fact, his trip to Moscow was canceled, and we don't know whether it has any continuation. So this year was clearly a year of missed opportunities, at least on the political scene. I don't see anything that would suggest that the year of 2021 will be the year of a breakthrough. I don't see any potential or any appetite for a breakthrough either in Europe or in Russia. And I think that unfortunately we will have to live with the 5 principles of Federica Mogherini for another couple of years. And by the way, in my opinion, these 5 principles can be also interpreted as the basis of the Russian policy towards the European Union, because essentially they can work not just for Brussels, but for Moscow as well. So this is the environment in which we have to operate. It will not change anytime soon, but this is exactly why I would like to underscore once again the importance of small-scale, incremental, practical actions in areas like the Green Deal or 5G, or maybe some cooperation in fighting international terrorism or cybercrime. I think that we should try to accumulate the critical mass that would allow us to go further and to become more ambitious in future. Thank you.
Andrei, thank you so much. And now I have the pleasure to hand over to Thierry. Bonjour to France. A great pleasure to have you also with us. And what is your take on the topic of today's webinar?
Well, thank you very much. I'm also very happy to be with you today and to see some friends. And even those whom I do not see, I know that they are here. So, I start with the three questions. Are we or should we be allies, partners, or rivals? I would say clearly today, are we allies? No. Are we partners? Not really. Are we rivals? Well, always, you know, France and Germany are allies, are partners, but they are also rivals. So it's a normal way in international life. That's the situation today. If you take the long-term approach, could we someday become allies? Yes. Could we someday, earlier maybe, become partners? My answer is yes. Will we remain rivals? My answer is yes, of course, because again, you know, that's the normal rivalry among nations. So what I would like to do with you this morning is to look at the short term on the one hand and the long term on the other. I will skip the middle term. Perhaps we can discuss that later on. Middle term is always difficult, like in economics, because it is the timing where things switch, you know, from the short to the longer terms. There's also the time scale of decision making, of big decision making. So what is the problem in the short term? I think we missed, this unfortunately, it was a little bit late, and when I arrived, I was listening to Hans Joachim Schwanger, and I shared a lot of what I heard. No, but I think that the problem in the short term is that we failed, and I understand also that Nadezhda said something I was told, we missed the opportunity of reconciliation in the 90s. And why did we miss that? As I think you said, Nadezhda, I was told, there are clearly shared responsibilities. But I do not hesitate myself to stress the Western responsibilities, because I think it was a huge mistake to assume that a country like post-communist Russia could become overnight a nice, well-behaved democracy in the Western style. I'm not sure that Western-style democracies are that good anyway, but it was clearly a mistake, and there was clearly a push on the Western side for regime change. And I think the huge political mistakes that the West is still now tempted to do, not only with Russia, is to push for regime change. I think this is a fundamental mistake that we're always tempted to do. But be that as it may, you know, the 90s were the years I visited Russia most often. I have visited Russia a lot in those years. And I have even diaries published in Russia on my visits in the 90s. And I know very well that around 1995, 1996, 7, the problem was, will the Russian Federation collapse entirely and be reduced to the Grand Duchy of Moscow? That was the real issue. So and the Western business, particularly, not only American, what they wanted to do was to conquer Russia, literally. That was not, I understand very well that it was not acceptable for Russia. So the result of that was the emergence of a new tough political regime in Russia, and total misunderstanding. And we're still living on the consequences of this misunderstanding. That is my interpretation. Now, logically, after the end of the Cold War, NATO, the alliances should have disappeared. You know, in history, usually alliances are dissolved when the causes, the basic causes for the existence of those alliances have disappeared. But it is not what have happened. And I think that one of the big problems today is that on the Western side, Russia is the necessary enemy that is required for NATO to continue to exist. And of course, the Russian side, they unfortunately make also a number of mistakes. We give food for on the Western side to continue to consider Russia as a potential enemy. And that's a very serious situation. In Germany, NATO is a taboo. You know, it's impossible even to have a discussion on NATO. Macron tried, you know, to force a debate when he said that NATO was on the verge, you know, of to have a brain collapse, which is a view I share myself. But you know, that's a scandal for some European partners, for especially Germany, for historical reasons. You just cannot say that. And for the new members of the European Union, such as Poland, for instance, they continue for historical reasons, which is not difficult to understand, to view, or the Baltic states, they continue to view Russia as the great potential adversary. So for all the reasons, NATO will continue in the foreseeable future to exist with Russia as its main potential adversary. And on the other side, on the Russian side, of course, you have all the tensions, the frozen conflicts, and all that can easily be explained by the natural dynamics I am trying to describe. So that make it extremely difficult to get out of this mess. Can we nonetheless do what Andrei called small scale incremental actions? Yes, of course. Yes, of course. But from an ideological point, I think that the tensions will continue to be very hard. You know, with Mr. Biden, well, by the way, I do not say that Biden was elected president of the United States. I say that Biden-Harris were elected president for the United States. It's the first time that it is really a couple, a tandem, which was elected president of the United States. And even if, as we all hope, Mr. President Biden's health will be good enough to have a full 4 years term, he will certainly not go for a second term, and Mrs. Harris, who has nothing to do with Europe in terms of age, in terms of her origins. She's a modern person in the US, and she probably doesn't care much about Europe. I mean, we have to keep that. It would be a big mistake to believe that because Mr. Biden was a good member of the NATO and all that, the future will be like the past. Certainly, definitely not. But the problem is that Congress will continue to insist very much, on human rights, and the Navalny case, and all these incidents will continue to be very much exploited. Sanctions will continue. They probably will be reinforced in some cases. So in the short term, there is not much we can expect. Now, let me say a few words about the long term. My personal conviction is simple. The US will push gradually for NATO to be transformed into an alliance against China. This is what will happen. And you can already identify some signs that the process has started, but it cannot be transformed openly as such immediately. You need some more incidents which will come in the way. In the South China Sea, potentially Taiwan, which of course is probably the one case where the real war could start, but it will take some time. Meanwhile, NATO will continue to be more or less as it is. And I remember, maybe some of you have not forgotten the name of André Fontaine. André Fontaine was for decades the great analyst of international affairs for the daily Le Monde in Paris. He was very famous until he died. He passed away about 10 years ago. But I remember very well in the 70s, when I was myself starting in the field of foreign affairs, André Fontaine told me, it's in the 70s, he told me someday NATO will become an alliance, including Russia, against China in the 70s. And I think we have no time to discuss this in depth today, of course. But I think this was an extremely interesting prophecy. But to switch from the situation in the short term to the situation in the long term, if that happens, if that prophecy is realized, it will be a relatively long story with a number of unknowns, of course. But I think that the US will push in that direction, and in some way, I think they have already started. And unfortunately, because of all the missed opportunities between the EU and Russia, and the West, Russia more generally, we have contributed to push you Russians, in towards China, which is certainly not in your long-term interest for a number of obvious historical, demographic, geographical reasons. So the equation is quite complex. And as I said, the EU, because of what we have inherited from the past, the EU cannot have in the short term a coherent foreign policy. It is not possible. The best we can do is to reduce our divergences, but we cannot have, and also the public opinions, including in France, are not particularly favorable in the short term to Russia. So let me conclude by focusing for a minute on EU itself. First point, EU is a great success. I think it was only naive people could believe that the European Union could be built in a day or even in a few years. The European Union process is a long-term process of integration. And I think it is remarkably successful if you look at all the circumstances under which it could have collapsed. So it is a great success. And if you remember what the situation was in the year 2019, at the time of the last election of the European Parliament, many people thought that it would be catastrophic. It was not. And the new Commission is quite active. And we have overcome the difficulties in 2020 in my judgment, a remarkable way. It is very easy to criticize all the things which went wrong, but on the whole, it has been very positive. And just think for a second, what could have happened in the European Union if the euro had not existed with the pandemic? Can you imagine the speculation, the currency speculation that would have taken place under those circumstances? It would have been a very terrible situation. But it is premature to think that the European Union could, in the short term, move closer to a coherent foreign policy. This we cannot expect. What can we expect? We, the French, we like to speak of strategic autonomy. I think the expression was mentioned maybe by Andrei. But I make a prediction. You know, this vocabulary will disappear soon from the vocabulary, from the phrasing of our ambitions, because the French are the only ones who want it. Certainly not, you know, Germany in all discussion just exclude the concept of strategic autonomy. We could speak of European sovereignty. This also is probably premature, and it raises a lot of passions, a lot of ideology. There is, however, one concept which today seems to be accepted by the Germans, by the French, and hopefully by others. This is technological sovereignty. Technological. Now the Germans are accepting these terms, which is new. You know, if you look at the history of the 80s, at the time of the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan, we had, I just went over that recently, we had very similar discussions. And at the time, there was no agreement on France and Germany, between France and Germany, on how to face the situation. Today, it is changing. And today, the idea that it is extremely important for Europe to become more autonomous, to have in the field of technology as a consequence, particularly of the new industrial revolution and so forth and so on, this is accepted. And this is very important. It is very important because it is the only way for Europe not to become a theater of operations for the main competitors, that is essentially the US and China. And I am very much struck that our in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and I think Andrei will recognize something. We were together last in October, I think it was a North Pavilion Dialogue, and our Asian friends, particularly from South Asia, said, we do not want to be forced to choose between US and China. They say that. And they said, you remember, Andrei, please, European Union, do the same, resist. No. And I think that in that direction, there are some real, modest, perhaps in the short term, possibilities also for cooperation. But this is closer to the small scale increments of Andrei. But we have to approach all these things both with the long term. We have to be realistic in the short term. We have to have a clear vision in the long term, and that's not easy. And we have to be relatively modest, active, but modest in the short to medium term. So this is my personal approach. Let me make a last point.
Very short.
Yes, sorry, I understand that I was too long. But it's a price, of asking a Frenchman to talk. I think one of the missed opportunities was the proposal of Medvedev, actually, that was in the first World Policy Conference in 2008, to review the CSC, and to have a fresh look at security in Europe. Today, the United States do not want that, the Germans do not, but very few people, the French even, do not want that. Nevertheless, at some point, I think the time could come where we could have such a review. So sorry for being too long, and now I promise you to say nothing, at least for a few minutes.
Thank you, Thierry, for your very, very enlightening comments and indeed structuring it in short, medium, and long-term sequence. So Marek, you're the next, and you're the only economist, if I'm correctly informed, on the panel. So we are very much looking to your forward to your views on the topic of today's discussion.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, I am economist. I don't know whether there are other economists in the panel, but I am not a specialist of international relations. Nor I am futurologist, so I would rather speak about what has happened or what is now. I want to speak about economic relation between EU and Russia, and I will start with small historical excursion. In 2006, the European Commission commissioned a feasibility study on the future potential EU-Russia free trade agreement. I had opportunity to participate in this study, so I can now refer to this. And this study was taken. I don't have time to go into technical details. Basically, basic assumption was that we start from the level of Russian commitments related to WTO accession, which was already negotiated at the time, the bilateral protocol with the EU, and then elimination of all tariffs on both sides and cutting non-tariff barriers of various kinds in respect to trade in goods, services, investment by half. And this was this most ambitious variant, so-called FTA plus, or then was got another name in the Commission jargon, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. And the results were substantial, especially for Russia. The gains, welfare gains, GDP gains were cumulative close to 8%. For EU was smaller. but also positive. This asymmetry was, of course, natural because of asymmetry of economic potential of both sides, and also because of the, at that time, Russian trade barriers were higher than European ones. 2 years later, we did another study, similar character, slightly different assumption. They gave similar results. At that time, European Commission DG Trade was quite interested and enthusiastic about going in this direction. What concerns individual member states, here position was varied between countries, but generally also was interest to in this in developing trade relations in this direction. To my surprise, reaction of on the Russian side, at least on technical level in the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade, was, I would say, skeptical. We hear the message, is too early, not now. First, we must complete WTO accession. Please do not publish the study. We don't want to antagonize various constituencies which may be against further liberalization of trade. So basically, this initiative was died at this time, even when the negotiation on the new partnership and cooperation agreement between both sides started in July 2008. Economic and trade negotiation agenda was quite limited, definitely didn't include perspective of free trade agreement of this time. And as all we know, negotiations were suspended in 2014 after annexation of Crimea. What has changed since 2009 when the second study was completed? Russia became WTO member in 2012, and as a result of accession, there was some trade and investment liberalization on the Russian side, so some things became easier from this point of view. But then we had sanction and counter-sanction in 2014 and after, which made things more difficult. There was also import substitution policy and other protectionist measures in Russia since 2014. In meantime, was Eurasian Economic Union was funded, which is also custom union, what in practical terms means that now any trade negotiation must be conducted not between EU and Russia, but between EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. What, by the way, may be beneficial for both sides, also for the EU, to mean perspective of access of broader markets than only Russia. There was also changes in trade geography in the meantime, partly as a result of this sanction, counter-sanction, and other adverse development, but partly, as I would say, result of some natural changes in the world economy and world economic potential. This is reflected, these two graphs coming from another Bruegel study of my colleagues, Alicia Garcia Herrero and Zhang Xu, published last year in the Russian Journal of Economics. And we see that the share of the EU in the Russian foreign trade is decreasing gradually, but not dramatically, while the share of China is increasing. But fair to say, China share, or more generally, Asia share in trade is increasing everywhere. In case of EU, in case of US, in case of other countries and continents. So the picture is different. But still, trade is so important between both sides that liberalization of this trade, it could give substantial benefits for both sides. What concerns foreign direct investment here, EU is has absolute dominance over China, over United States, so it's major investors, foreign investor in Russia. But also one side of the story is the internal barriers, which negatively affect business and investment climate in Russia. And here I would like to refer to another study which was recently published by the European Commission, which also I have personal opportunity to contribute in some way. This is a so-called study about major distortion in the Russian economy, but I would like to say there's nothing dramatic. This is a very comprehensive study. I very much advise to look in this. There are positive news from this study is that Russian economy is much less distorted than, for example, Chinese one. And its economic, legal, institutional system is much more compatible with the European one than in case of China. So basically, again, from institutional systemic side, there is no so serious barriers as in the case, for example, in China, which could not be overcome. Nevertheless, there are some serious distortion, and I point to some of them: excessive state ownership and concentration in several sectors like energy, banking, raw materials, part of military industrial complex, but not only. Then there are still a serious restriction to foreign investment. Some of them were increased after 2014. There are still price distortion in the energy sector, much smaller than they was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but still they are, meaning that Russia domestic energy prices are lower than European ones. So this also has impact on the cost of production in several energy-intensive sectors. The same is railway transportation in several raw materials sectors. Part of this price distortion result from export restriction, export duties, export taxes, and this kind of instruments. Then is unequal access to public procurement by foreign companies and domestic companies. And there are serious import substitution programs, which translated into EU jargon state aid. Here, but fair to say, of course, there is some here gap between some programs, declaration and actual implementation, but still this may be serious problem in several sectors. Plus, what is very well known also by Russian business communities is legal instability, weak protection of property rights, lack of independent judicial power, excessive role of law enforcement and security agencies, etc. What are the prospects? Still, as I underlined, is a large potential of closer trade investment relation between the EU and Russia. And from a Russian point of view, the point of view of Russian economy, this could be of crucial importance for modernization of the Russian economy. The problem which was mentioned by Nadezhda Arbatova, this is still actual agenda. However, it's quite clear that prospects of upgrading economic cooperation depend on the improvement in EU-Russia political relation. And here, I am not futurologist, so I will not risk building scenario, especially 10 years from now. Actually, we don't know what will happen everywhere in the next half a year. But it's, I think, reasonable to assume that serious obstacles, political obstacles in bilateral relation remain short to medium term perspective. So basically, this is what I presented, this rather agenda for longer term than shorter term perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo, Marek. And now we come to the to Andrei Baikov. Thank you for joining today, and you will be the last speaker on the first round. So we are very much looking forward to your perspective on the topic.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to the organization for putting this together. I find this extremely rewarding to be able to share our views on such acute topics. Well, I would like to maybe address another question posed before us, not the one whether we are partners, allies, or what was it? Enemies or friends, but the one which preceded that, and namely on the 4 scenarios developed by the European and Russian experts. I will remind you what those scenarios were. They were cold partnership, descending into anarchy, on the brink of war, and community of values. And the question put to us runs, which of those scenarios will prevail? But instead of giving a direct answer, I would like to talk briefly about specific points that I find problematic in these scenarios from the perspective of Russia's interests. First of all, I believe there was a certain selection bias when putting the expert group together. From what I've been able to see, it mainly includes experts who have been professionally concentrating on Russia-EU relations as the crux of their professional portfolio. And hence, by default, they have a more favorable attitude towards the EU and the development of the relations between Russia and the EU at large. At the same time, the principal conclusion of this scenario building exercise is that it is the internal factors that will ultimately play the decisive role. But in this case, it was necessary, I think, to bring in experts on Russia's domestic policy, on Russia's economic development, and on other priority geographical areas of Russia's multi-vector foreign policy, so as to elaborate scenarios that would genuinely reflect the entire spectrum of Russia's geopolitical priorities. As most commentators would agree, I'm pretty sure, Russia views Europe as only one of its images or projections of its geopolitical repertoire. Russia likes to think of itself as having a broad spectrum of foreign policy choices, among which Europe is only a part. This line of thinking arises from Russia's long-standing geopolitical tradition of maintaining equidistance from the major powers and styling itself as the sole Eurasian power that has ever constituted itself in the international arena. It also points to the fact that Russia's principal aspiration is to keep up its self-sufficiency and autonomy in determining its external and internal policies. This trend of geopolitical thinking is supported by deep-seated historical justifications of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union after that, who were effectively Eurasian powers, participating in the balance of power in both regions, Europe and Asia, and controlling to a considerable degree the dynamic in both parts of the world. This hadn't been the case before the Imperial Russian history began, but even during the reign of Moscow Tsars, Russia had already been and felt itself the frontier state of Europe, facing off with the East, encroaching on its borders and territory. So the mission of fending off the incursions from the East over the centuries has become ingrained into the Russian geopolitical mentality and is still impacting Russia's foreign policy identity today. Coming back to my initial point on the signs of selection bias on the Russian side, I wonder if the same selection bias took place in terms of including European experts on the list. My second point regards the positive changes in relations between Russia and the EU in the scenario, the community of values. These positive changes should occur only after Russia's economic weakening and after a series of social protests eventually leading to regime change. In the most likely scenario, which is the scenario number 1, cold partnership, the improvement of relations also occurs only after the reforms in Russia against the backdrop of falling export revenues and depletion of reserves. The EU is becoming the leader in the settlement in the Donbass and is gradually lifting sanctions on the Donbass. So somehow I get the feeling that the reforms described in the scenario correspond to a more idealized Western liberal recipes in the spirit of the Washington Consensus, fighting corruption, improving the investment climate, reforming the judicial system, large-scale investments in agriculture, green economy, the new energy technologies. Despite the described reforms, according to the scenario, the EU will continue to criticize the situation with the human rights and democracy in Russia, and there is still no full trust between the parties. In fact, this scenario strikingly resembles the picture from the 90s. And that was how the West perceived Russia back in the day. Only instead of Crimea, there was Chechnya. The similarity is emphasized by the presence in the scenario of this figure of the popular communist leader Sergei Kumach, who causes irritation in the West, just as in the time of the 90s, Gennady Zyuganov caused this irritation. The third point is that as an unaffiliated reader of this report, I could sense some hidden agenda in it. In the scenarios, there is this idea emphasized repeatedly that the growth of US and China's influence will lead to a new bipolarity and the struggle of China and the US for influence, which is not good for either Russia or the EU. Thus, one gets the feeling that the EU is obviously part of this Western camp, resenting China's rise, and therefore the West as a whole is making attempts to convince Russia that cooperation with China does not correspond to Russia's national interests. My fourth point is that none of the experts considered the community of values scenario as the most likely to be implemented by 2030. But nevertheless, I for one am bothered by the fact that the community of values implies that it is Russia that transforms. It is Russia that adopts the values of the EU, following effectively a regime change, while the EU itself does not or need not change. So in this case, this scenario should rather be called export of values. And again, rapprochement is only possible under this scenario after the economic weakening of Russia. From Russia's point of view, at least officially, rapprochement between Russia and the EU under this scenario would be also possible on the basis of the idea of integration of integrations, embodied in the project of Greater Eurasian Partnership, in which the parties interact on a pragmatic basis in order to create a common economic and humanitarian space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Unfortunately, this option was not included in the first scenario either, considered by the experts as most probable. It only refers to the start in 2030 of negotiations between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union on some cooperation roadmaps, but nothing else. At the same time, I believe that the Greater Eurasian Partnership is instrumental because it will be able to allow China to be involved in regional processes, instead of being seen just as the source of destructive forces in the international arena and in Eurasia, in the Eurasian continent more generally. On a more general note, I would like to point out that unlike the previous 2 decades, there are some foundations for optimism in terms of Russian-EU relations. For example, now we surprisingly coincide in the assessment of the current trends in the international environment. Both the EU and Russia believe that the world is actually transitioning from unipolarity to multipolarity. Both the EU and Russia believe that the confrontational potential of the system is on the rise and that we are back to great power security competition. Finally, both the EU and Russia agree that the international liberal order is failing and that the principal culprit are the rising powers. I think it is quite clear what Russia wants from the EU. It is the return to realpolitik paradigm of foreign policy thinking. I could express it more accurately. Russia wants rationality. Very few illusions about Europe persist to this day in Russian decision-making circles. Russian relations with key European countries are indeed historically close, but they're inherently conflictual and mixed with pain and bitterness of disillusionment. But the question is, are we fully ready to put aside the past and focus on the future? I think people on both sides admit that we both need each other, but it is also clear that we increasingly detest each other's inner characteristics, but the EU more than Russia, I believe. Why do we need each other and in what areas? I would say that most of what I've said previously can be applied to our elites. They do indeed live according to different scripts, but the society is much more diverse and pragmatic in this regard. It transcends the boundaries and ideological fault lines that have emerged between the elites. I would say that Russia and the EU must be sufficiently grown up to realize that their common need is to manage their increasingly transnational and apolitical societies that actually seek interaction despite how the official authorities treat each other. This paramount task is by far the most dignified and challenging one, but it is also an inherently liberal one. and it could be the platform for our cooperation. Pending that, the geopolitical standoff, which is currently at its height, is penetrating the areas that should stay out of politics and out of ideology, and that is highly regrettable. But this is not everything. There is also lack of honesty of what Europe's strategy towards Russia is, and that is a fair question, which comes down to a quite clear dichotomy. It either seeks to jointly co-organize our common continent by choosing where to disagree, but also pragmatically choosing the areas where cooperation is feasible. Or it's a strategy to subvert the political system. If the latter is true, then there is no future for the bilateral political relations. And the EU should well understand what consequences this policy will have for both Russia, as well as for the future of the continent. What the EU as a political institutional framework has invariably failed to understand is that the Russian body politic has always generated within itself the impulses for self-healing and self-rejuvenation. And it does not need, and it resents external pressure to evolve and advance towards the form of self-government that it suits its needs. Self-determination, I think, is the highest principle and maybe the only one worthy of protection in this world. But unfortunately, this is unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future, and a much gloomier picture is in sight. And thus, this context leaves me wishing that the coronavirus pandemic be the worst of troubles we have yet to endure in our bilateral relations. Thank you very much.
Andrei, thank you for ending on this positive note, that there are also factors that inspire optimism, and that despite all the other factors you described. Now, as usual during such interesting events, it's kind of difficult to stay in schedule, and so I would spontaneously propose that we take the questions from the audience right away. It should be most valuable for you, the participants, and I will simply wait in the meantime while we wait for the first questions to come, while we wait for the first, your member, raise your hand, use the hand raise icon. And while we wait for that, I will then ask some questions, but only as long as no other questions from the audience pops up, and that is still to come. So I would like to start with a question maybe to Joachim. You said that in a policy of small steps, others, a recent paper by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Vienna has called it islands of cooperation approach, and spillover effects from the bottom would hopefully build up things, trust, some moments of cooperation that could then lead to a more positive dynamic. My question would be, how can this succeed to reach the tipping point without having this kind of accompanying dynamic on the top, without having a vision? I remember the colloquial word that exists from Helmut Schmidt about the visions, but still, how can this tipping point be reached without this?
Well, I mean, it's probably not possible to fix a clear line which needs to be crossed in order to get the point of no return. That doesn't exist. But what I found interesting is that as far as there was some agreement among the presentations that this bottom-up approach was the only one which came up by all the speakers, even by Andrei in his last presentation. What he called apolitical societies cooperating. Leave it aside whether they are apolitical or not. The issue is that as we can observe now, we have these combinations between partnership on the one hand and rivalry on the other. Rivalry being an eternal element in state relations, as Thierry de Montbrial quite rightly stated, but it has different degrees of seriousness, and this rivalry between Russia and the western part of the European continent is clearly more serious than the one between Germany and France these days. These are elements which are closely connected to grand designs, to visions, to misunderstandings in the very self-concept on both sides. Whereas the partnership element, which you can equally observe, be it the activities of the AEB, be it the activities in the academic fields, these partnerships are clearly delineated from these great visions. This is everyday business. What I have to add to that is that I grew up during the Cold War, physically and in my academic career. So I'm very familiar with the situation which existed up until the end of the 1980s. And these actually were two worlds apart. So we have passed now not even 30 years of gradually moving together on a partnership trajectory. And I think we simply will have to have these experiences, as had the European Union, as Thierry quite rightly pointed to. This cannot be built during one day if it has to be built from scratch. The history of the European Union was one of many decades to arrive at the situation we have arrived now. The starting point between Russia and the western part of the European continent is quite different. Also for the reason that the experience after 1945 has been quite different. So I think we are in for a long haul. We have to be cautious and have to have a long breath in that respect. But I'm quite sure it's the only way, focusing on where partnership is really functioning and making sure that this is not being spoiled or inhibited by, you either call it political elites or by the governments and by the grand designs.
Thank you, Hans-Joachim. There is one question now coming up in the chat. Nadia, you also wanted to say something. Is that right?
Yes, I have a few comments, if it is.
Yes, sure.
If we have time. Well, first of all, about the allied relations between Russia and EU against Chinese aggression, expansion. I think that theoretically it is possible, but the reality is absolutely different. And within the multilateral world, we see the emergence of new bipolarity with two poles, China and the United States, and it is a bipolarity between liberal and authoritarian capitalism. And both China and the United States have their own allies. And Russia is with China, no doubt about that. Why? Not because our leadership does not understand that China does not present an existential threat to its territorial integrity. Yes, they understand this. But at the same time, China does not present any threat to the existing political order. While with the European Union, it is quite the opposite. The EU doesn't present any existential threat to Russia's territorial integrity, but it presents a threat to the existing political and economic order. So I can't believe that there could be an alliance, but only in an ideal situation. About the small step tactics, I never believed that these tactics can bring visible results. Again, only in the context, only in a benign context, these steps can be useful, which is why I fully support Macron's initiatives, because he sends a message to our leadership. European countries are not anti-Russian. So we need, in order to become engaged by European countries, we need this benign international environment, and it is needed for our domestic reforms. And my last point about missed opportunities. I cannot agree that the last year was a year of missed opportunities, because there were no opportunities at all. After 9/11, many people believed that a common enemy scenario would radically change the nature of the Russia-West relations. Nothing of this kind happened, and the same with COVID-19. Unfortunately, this is our reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Sorry.
May I react briefly on what Nadezhda said?
Okay, and then I would like to ask the question that came up in the chat. No, Thierry, please go ahead. I think we should be live and debateful.
It is a very important point. Well, first, I think that Macron attempted this rapprochement because he has some people who suggested, including people like myself, it is something that should be done. Unfortunately, he met a lot of resistance from other partners in Europe for the reasons I mentioned before, because of the ideology of NATO as it is today, because of countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, Germany to some extent, and but also the ideological, the French public opinion is very much on the ideological line. Not to use, I don't know if he's still there, Mr. Baikov, I don't know if he's still with us, but what he called the irrational approach. I don't know if it is a proper term, but the fact is that for the public opinion in Europe in general, including in France, is not in that direction. And on the question of China, this is why I insisted so much at the beginning between the short term and the long term. Of course, in the short term, you are much more towards China. In the long term, I cannot imagine that it could be the case over, let's say, the next 30 or 40 years, the next 29 years, if you prefer, because 2049 will be a very important anniversary.
Jerry, let me just add one follow-up question since you brought it up with China. In this prediction by André Fontaine, the longtime correspondent of Le Monde, the current modus operandi between China and Russia is not always together, but never against each other. Why would it be beneficial for Russia to abandon this modus, or do you think this modus is compatible with joining alliance that would be this alliance that André envisioned?
For two reasons, the first one is east of the Ural Mountains, the Russian territory is 10 million square kilometers with a population of 25 million inhabitants. The territory of China is 9 million square kilometers. That is smaller than the Russian territory east of the Ural Mountains. The population is 1.3 billion inhabitants. So you don't have to be a great magician to understand that there is a problem here. The second reason is economic. And I think that there is a strong correlation in the long term, not in the short term. In the long term, you have a very strong correlation between the power in general and the economic power in particular. And Russia is failing right now. No, the EU is not doing very well. And within the EU, you have some discrepancies too. I know that very well, including between France and Germany, for instance. But in the long term, I think that the fate of Russia depends on its economic development, that is its capacity for modernization. It is not still the case, and demography. And these long-term trends for the time being, as not favorable, whereas they are very favorable for China.
Thank you, Thierry. And there is a question in the chat, Marek, that goes to you, which is a question that due to the fact that there is the Eurasian integration going on, there is also a kind of institutional blockage to any kind of bilateral free trade agreement. So one thing would be, what do you think as for the prospects of resuming any kind of free trade or integration talk between the two integrational projects? Or do you see a higher potential for preferential trade agreements that the EU could conclude with partners of that integration project on a bilateral basis on a very limited scope of services, for instance, or topics?
I already started to answer in written form. Of course, I can answer from technical point of view, because there are also political obstacles which we discuss extensively and which I already mentioned. But from the technical point of view, let me answer first possibility of negotiation between EU and individual member states of the Eurasian Economic Union. Such partial agreements agreement is possible, but only in respect to issues which are not in exclusive competences of the Eurasian Economic Union. And here I think the good example is the CEPA between EU and Armenia. This means comprehensive, let me look, because fortunately I have already poor memory to various names. Comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement between Armenia and EU, which covers partly services and investment issue, but basically the issue which are not in competences of the Eurasian Economic Union. Then regarding bloc negotiation between EU and Eurasian Economic Union on any broader trade deal, apart from political obstacles, there is also one technical obstacle, the fact that Belarus is still not member of WTO, is negotiating candidate to WTO, but it still didn't join WTO. All other members of Eurasian Economic Union, Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, are WTO members. So this is the short answer.
Thank you, Marek. And I have a question also for Andrei Kortunov. So if we look at the dynamics that are currently going on, I'm like Marek, I'm an economist. So if I apply one concept from economics to current political situation, what struck me recently was that it could be seen as a kind of deflationary dynamics. When you have inflation, the money loses value and you rather spend today than tomorrow. On the contrary, in a deflation situation, you rather expect that the prices will be less tomorrow and that you will receive more tomorrow, so you wait. And to what extent do you think this is a concept that explains the current dynamics? I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, in political scientists call this strategic inaction, that you wait until you have a better deal on the table. So to what extent do you think this accurately describes the current situation, deflationary dynamics, and maybe how it could be broken?
Well, I think that it's a good way to describe the situation that we see right now between Russia and the European Union, though I still insist that there were some chances that we didn't use over this year, which is coming to the end. And I am sure that if indeed Macron had come to Moscow and I was marginally engaged in the preparation of this trip, we might have moved somewhere, at least on a very moderate scale, but it could have been a game changer to some extent. But I agree with you that the perceptions on both sides is that the other side will get weaker. And if the other side gets weaker over time, you can have a better deal with the other side. If you take the Russian leadership, I assume that the perception is that the European Union will not overcome its current crisis anytime soon. And there'll be a change of the leadership in many countries. Maybe we will have partners in Europe to deal with who are going to be superior to the current leadership in the Union or elsewhere. At least I don't think that there is any incentive in Moscow to move ahead right now. Besides, they want to see, to look at the dynamics of the transatlantic relationship, whether Biden is a success or a failure, and definitely that sets another constraint on the way of more active approach to Europe. I think that in Moscow, to the extent I can judge about the current moods, the overall perception that we did everything that we could. Our proposals are on the table, and basically there is not much more that we can offer the European Union. And if you recall, I think someone has already mentioned it, Minister Lavrov articulated this position quite eloquently, saying that probably we should stop our negotiations with the European Union because they lead to nothing. Whether this approach is justified or not is another question, but I think that such an approach does exist in the corridors of power in this city. The same might be applied to the European Union because the perception, I think, the perception in Brussels is that Russia will come out of this crisis weaker than many other international players, maybe including the European Union. Russia is going to suffer more, like any emerging economy. And on top of that, the European dependence on Russia in the energy field is likely to decrease with the progress reached in the implementation of the Green Deal. So basically, Europe has nothing to lose if it waits for, I don't know, for another year or 2 or 5 years to see the changes in Russia, which will come anyway. And again, the perception, I think, in Europe is that Russia will be forced to engage in economic modernization, and this economic modernization will sooner or later lead to, if not to a complete regime change, at least to a very significant transformation of the current political regime that we have in Moscow. So I think this is what we have right now. That's why, I would, despite the criticism from Nadezhda, I would still say that small steps are important. It's not a situation when we have to choose between small steps and big steps. But there is no appetite, no incentives for big steps on either side. So it's a choice between small steps and no steps. So if this is the choice that we have to confront, I would still suggest that we should not miss opportunities to engage into something small, practical, not really ambitious, but at least something that can identify certain opportunities for progress. Again, my take is that we will have a couple of years, maybe 3 years, maybe 4 years, as a period of very slow progress, if any progress at all. And I trust my hopes with the generational changes in the leadership, both in Moscow and in Europe. I think that this change will probably come by mid-2020s, 24, 25. And this change might open new opportunities for bigger and more ambitious joint initiatives. But we still have to work to prepare these initiatives and to make sure that we will address these opportunities better than we did 30 or 20 years ago.
Thank you, Andrei, for this plaidoyer in favor of small steps better than nothing. I think at AB we also are in favor of really, and thanks for your kind words to the AB that in your initial statement, we also are in favor of let's keep the channels open, even if we understand that, even if we have to disagree on the fundamental points, we still need to do what we can in the meantime. Before I raise the question that is now in the chat, I would like to give one question to Andrei Vaikov. Andrei, in your statement, you highlighted a number of issues in the Western position, like misunderstandings, misreadings, fallacies, wrong assumptions regarding Russia, like repeating the approach of the 90s, of the Washington Consensus, misreading of Russia's internal development potential, and so on. So my mirror question to you would be, since it always takes two to tango, what are the misreadings of the Russian leadership with regard to the EU?
Well, I think it's quite easy actually to answer that. First of all, I think you're overemphasizing what I was trying to get across. I was rather referring to the scenarios, and
no, I understand. It's just
a bit
one aspect.
Lopsided in the dimensions that I pointed out. But it's very easy to answer the question where we got it wrong with regards to Europe. I think we still don't appreciate quite what is the role of values in how policies are being construed and pursued. I think when we expect rationality, and that's what I put forward as one of the end games for Russia, one of the goals, that is how we perceive the world. We want everyone to be like us, to be pragmatic and rational. And it's hard for us to come to terms with the fact that for some, values and value-driven policies is something they just cannot renounce, maybe at some point. But overall, it determines to a large extent how partners are viewed. The image of partner is viewed. And you cannot just withdraw this from the equation. And that is hard to understand. And very often we're trying to find some actual pragmatic motive behind the policies and don't buy into the value talk. But very often it is the value talk which strikes all the right chords.
Thank you, Andrei, and I fully agree with you. Your topic you covered is obviously much broader. I just wanted to pick out this aspect, not to say that this was the main point you were making. And Philippe Goyer, who is a member of our board, he asked a question about, well, we are a business association, and so when our members look at these prospects that all of you have just outlined, it's a very complex situation, and indeed the perspectives are not looking very good. So any of you, what would be the recommendations to business, or what should the business do? I think you can be free to pick up this question if you want. Jerry.
Well, if nobody, well, I think Russia is a great country. Europe is a combination of relatively great countries. And I think that we have to play the card of a long-term rapprochement, even if it is difficult, because I think, again, to use Andrei Vaikov's word, it is rational to do so. At the same time, we have, we big business side also to remain flexible enough to adjust to unpleasant or pleasant circumstances when they come. But if you allow me, I would like to ask myself a question to our Russian participants here, especially to Andrei Kortunov, because we alluded to 2024, that is the next presidential election in Russia. And the question is, do you have the impression that President Putin is preparing his succession so that it comes in a smooth way? Because I think it's a very important, critical issue for everything else, including for the business perspective.
Hans-Joachim, I see you want to answer that question.
No, I don't want to answer the Russian question. I wanted to answer the business question.
Okay, so let's answer the business question first, and then we give a bit of time to our Russian colleagues to answer the question of Thierry.
Well, I think the answer is quite simple. Business doesn't have a political purpose or message, but it has political side effects. They are not clear-cut because prior to the First World War, we had these free trade pacifists who thought that the closer you get economically, the less risk you will have to wage war. As we all know, that didn't happen. It happened the opposite way. But nevertheless, the purpose of business is to make profits. And as long as you can make profits on either side, be it in Russia or be it for Russian business in the European Union, the task of the political realm of the governments is to make sure that this can materialize. And if that is being made sure on both sides through negotiations, everything else, to creating the proper conditions for making profit, I think the positive political side effects will come by anyway.
Thank you. And Marek, previously you also wanted to say something for the business question. So let's take your comment on the business question, and then Nadezhda, Andrei, please answer the question of Thierry.
Basically, my answer is the same as Hans-Joachim answered, that business must follow pragmatic consideration and shouldn't go to politics itself. And the rest depends on the assessment of potential benefits and cost of any decision, any deal, any investment, and of course risk assessment, and which not only in case of doing business in Russia, but in other cases, we are not always fully certain what will be conditions. Nobody, for example, could forecast a pandemic, which happened this year. So basically, very much depends on individual risk assessment, risk appetite. Usually accepting higher risk means more potential profit, but also more potential losses. So this is, but I would strongly recommend businesses which are engaged or want to be engaged in Russia to follow business on pragmatic consideration. But of course, this requires also understanding the environment, not only economic environment, but also political, legal environment. And but again, I think it's not role of business to go in great politics. It's role of.
Thank you so much, Marek. Nadezhda and Andrei.
Thank you. In my view, business should do what it can do. And even in the Cold War time, we have trade relations and we have economic interaction. So I think that political and business are closely interrelated. The better business relations between Russia and the EU individual member states, the better our political relations, and of course, vice versa. Thank you.
Andrei, maybe the question of Thierry. Andrei Kortunov.
Okay, so I cannot pretend that I know what Mr. Putin is planning to do in 2024, but what I know for sure are two things. First of all, the political transition in Russia has started this year. It might go slower, it might go faster, but basically we are entering a new period in our political life. And second, this transition is not only or even mostly about one leader being replaced by another leader. It is much more fundamental. It's about transformation of the political system. And I think that it's not an over-exaggeration to argue that if we get together here in the end of 2024 or in 2025, we will see a very different political environment compared to what we have right now. I don't want to state that it would be a better environment for business, for Europe, for Russia's relations with the West, but it will be a different environment. And finally, let me say that to some extent, the answer to your question depends on developments not just within Russia, but also within other parts of the world, including the European Union, because any decision that President Putin might take about his state power or, him delegating powers to a new generation of leaders will partially depend on his assessment of the international situation. And this is what we should keep in mind. I think that if indeed we see a very fundamental crisis in the West, deeper than what we have right now, Putin might be incentivized to stay longer. If he can rely on a more or less stable situation outside of Russian borders, he might choose to step down sooner rather than later. I'm not in a position to judge, but definitely the international environment is a factor that will affect his decisions on his personal future and on the changes in the Russian political system.
Thank you, Andrei, for answering the question of Thierry. And dear colleagues, dear participants, let me thank Nadezhda Arbatova, Thierry de Montbrial, Marek Dombrovski, Andrei Kortunov, Hans-Joachim Spanger, Andrei Baikov for their very insightful contributions to today's discussion. It has been extremely interesting and for us inspiring and important to hear your views, your assessment. I think indeed a sober assessment of what the current situation is and how we got there is the cornerstone of any kind of consideration how to move ahead. So in this sober assessment, you outlined the mutual misperceptions, the difference in interests. Some of them seem to be irreconcilable currently. And then the result of this being that the potential for lifting cooperation currently to a next level being quite limited. At the same time, in our analysis, we must, as Nadezhda outlined, avoid the blame game, avoid this kind of falling always back into the same figures of talk, of just finding the culprit, and should find a new honesty in regard to what we really want in our policies. And based on this sober assessment and on the honesty in the policy formulation, maybe, and this was an important contribution by Thierry, in the short term, and by Hans-Joachim, if we follow the short-term small steps approach, then we can build up the momentum that is needed, lay out the foundation that are needed to create the long-term rapprochement. So pragmatism and small steps in the short term, and a bit more audacious plans and hopes for the long-term future. It was very insightful, and thanks for sharing this view with us. I think this is an exercise we should repeat after a certain number of months to see what has changed and what are maybe new trends that are emerging, especially since we now heard from Andrei, we are already in the middle of all these processes. They are not limited to a specific date, and they are not limited to certain key figures. I think this is true for Russia, but this is also true for the changes that are ahead on the EU side. Let me wish you, all of you, a nice rest of the day and the week, and a peaceful and hopefully a bit more relaxing than the rest of the year, Christmas and New Year holidays, and very much looking forward to see both our speakers and you, our members, very soon on either online or offline. Thank you and goodbye.